Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today at the 45th Annual AAGHS Conference. My name is Kathy Terleski, and I will be sharing with you today progress on work I've been doing to find and publish the names of the enslaved persons of my ancestors. I want to thank my friend Linda Critchlow-White for introducing me to AAGHS and encouraging me to submit an abstract for the meeting this year. As a reminder, AAGHS does not allow recordings or screenshots of material as they are protected by copyright. I will share with you how to access the information I am presenting today. My talk today is on rebuilding the family lineages and history of over 600 enslaved persons of the Union Hill plantations in Nelson County, Virginia. I am currently the genealogist for the Cabell Family Society, and our website that I refer to several times in this presentation is www.cabell.com. My talk will focus on the source material I used from the Cabell family in Virginia, focusing on the Cabells of Union Hill. I will go over the research approach and methodology I used and how to use the final data set, and also share my thoughts on how to apply this methodology across other data sets. I want to start with a brief introduction of the Cabell family of Virginia. Dr. William Cabell immigrated to Virginia about 1723 and married Elizabeth Burks. They are considered the founders of the Cabell family in Virginia. Dr. William Cabell, who had first settled on the James in Goochland County, decided to move west and staked out 20 miles of low grounds on the James River, beginning 15 miles above present-day Scottsville. He established his home on the lower banks of Swan Creek in Nelson County, and he built his home, Liberty Hall, on this site. By 1753, Dr. Cabell owned close to 26,000 acres of land along the James River, on both sides of the James River, and established a community around the supply trade down the James River. The prosperity enjoyed by Dr. Cabell and his family was in large part due to the enslaved persons performing the manual labor associated with running the farm, mills, blacksmiths, boats, and plantation house. He had 5 children that survived to adulthood and are shown here. Their children and grandchildren acquired and transferred the land, building multiple large plantations in Buckingham, Amherst, and Nelson County, Virginia. John and Joseph left the area and did not permanently settle in the area. Joseph went from Buckingham County to Kentucky around 1800, and John Cabell primarily moved from Buckingham County to Lynchburg or West Virginia. Nicholas Cabell and Mary Cabell did remain in the Nelson County area. Mary Cabell married into the Horsley family, and they were centered around Gladstone, which is also in Nelson County. Nicholas Cabell was the youngest Cabell, and he inherited the Liberty Hall plantation from his father, and his descendants remained there until the end of the Civil War. William Cabell Jr. is the father of the Cabells of Union Hill. This talk focuses on him and his first 4 children that built up the Union Hill neighborhood of plantations. The early census of Virginia provides some insight into the size of the Cabell family plantations in 1782 and 1787. The 1782 heads of family census shows in the table on the left that the largest holder of enslaved persons was John Tabb. George Washington was number 5 in the state, and William Cabell was 24th. He declared in this census he had 90 blacks residing with him in Amherst County. This is also within the range he declares in his journal in 1780. He said, quote, "I now have 100 Negroes." You can also see this data in this data from 1782 other Cabell family members, including Nicholas Cabell, Samuel Jordan Cabell, and William Cabell Jr. I've also included the men who married or are descended from Cabell women, including Roderick McCulloch and William and John Horsley. In 1787, the first census of Virginia was taken and counted people differently. But William Cabell Sr. here declared 43 white males between ages 16 and 21, 50 blacks over 16, and 20 blacks under 16. I want to point out that William Cabell used enslaved persons, overseers, indentured persons, and rented help to farm his land holdings. There are numerous events documenting these types of agreements and arrangements, providing valuable genealogical data for all of these groups of people. John Rose was the son of Reverend Robert Rose, who was also one of the earliest settlers in Amherst County, Virginia, and also intermarried with the Cabell family. This project focused on a subset of the Cabell family plantations, those of William Cabell Jr. and 4 of his children. I chose these plantations since they were in proximity to each other along the James River and all came from the original Union Hill landholdings. This map shows Nelson County, Virginia along the James River with Buckingham on the south and east side of the river. I go back and forth in the presentation talking about the Union Hill home and the Union Hill neighborhood. I want to try and clarify that here. The Union Hill home is located in the middle of the gray area on the map along the James River. The Union Hill neighborhood plantations are all the homes shaded in gray that were derived from the original Union Hill home. The second William Cabell extended his land holdings to include an additional 5,700 acres almost west of present-day Lovingston, Virginia. This area is bounded by the dotted line. The table at the bottom shows the original land deed was 1,785 acres, and by 1855 there were 6 named plantations on this original plot of land. From the intersection of the Tye River on the west side to the current town of Wangina on the east side, they are shown here: Montezuma, Norwood, Union Hill, Colleton, Rockcliffe, and Soldier's Joy. Montezuma, Rockcliffe, and Soldier's Joy are still standing. Only Rockcliffe, the newest plantation, having been established in 1854, is still owned by a Cabell descendant today. This is a photo of the Union Hill site on the left from Google Earth. You can see the current Union Hill home site and the Cabell Family Cemetery to the left. The Cabell Family Society owns this graveyard and performs maintenance on the graveyard annually. There's also a slave cemetery down the hill behind the house just inside the woods. The Find a Grave online site lists the Union Hill Slave Cemetery and provides 15 names of people buried there. It is believed, however, that there are over 150 persons buried there, yet very few have legible markers. One of these is inscribed with the name of Henry Bowling, who died in 1886. This cemetery is owned by the owner of the Union Hill property and is currently maintained by Pete Rose, who is descended from the enslaved persons of Union Hill. The Union Hill home was built around 1776. This photo shows the home as it stood in 1981. It is no longer standing. It was dismantled and moved to Richmond. A new home was built on the site in the 1990s. The owners of the Union Hill home were as followed: William Cabell Sr., the oldest son of Dr. William Cabell, lived there from 1778 until his death in 1798. The asterisk indicates that they kept journals that were used in this study. At that time, at his death, it passed to his second son, William Cabell Jr., who was also called Billy. Billy and his wife, Ann Carrington, lived in the home until his death in 1822. Billy and his wife, Ann, had 14 children, and their 11th child, Mayo Cabell, took over operations of the home in 1822 when William Cabell Jr. died. Mayo was only 22 years old at the time. After his mother's death in 1838, he inherited the home. Though Mayo was running the large Union Hill plantation from 1822 until his death in 1869, I could only find journals from 1850 to 1869. So there is a gap in information from 1822 to 1850 that is about a generation of persons that are lost due to the lack of data. Mayo's sister, Sarah Carrington Cabell, did keep a journal that I found and was during the 1820s, though she did not have a lot of references to enslaved persons. Mayo had 16 children between his 2 wives, and 2 of his sons, William Daniel Cabell and Joseph Carrington Cabell Jr., became plantation owners on neighboring plantations of Norwood and Colleton. Joseph Carrington Cabell Jr. only lived briefly at Colleton and was killed in the Civil War. At Mayo's death, the home passed to his second wife, Carolyn Anthe, and she deeded the home to her son-in-law, Alexander Brown, who married one of her daughters. When that daughter passed away, Alexander Brown married another one of her single daughters. He was a historian who first published on the Cabell family papers and genealogy. The last Cabell occupant was Mayo's unmarried daughter, Lucy Gilmer Cabell, who died there in 1939. The home passed to her younger brother and my great-grandfather, Edward Marshall Cabell. Upon his death in 1946, my grandfather and his sister inherited the home and its contents. This is a home that had been in the same family for 170 years. From the volumes of information I've been able to find, it seems that it contained 170 years of papers and artifacts in 1946. The 2 siblings preserved the historical journals and documents, donating them to repositories across Virginia, including the University of Virginia, the Library of Virginia, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and the Swim Library at William and Mary. As I began transcribing the personal journals of my ancestors from the Union Hill home, I began to realize the interconnectedness with the other plantations in Nelson, Amherst, and Buckingham County. This project could have rapidly expanded to include nearly every plantation east of the mountains of Nelson and Amherst County. So I decided to limit my study just to those of William Cabell and 4 of the children. This busy table here shows the names of the enslavers that I researched and the source information used for each one of them that I was able to find. I did find farm plantations from Soldier's Joy at the Library of Virginia and otherwise used wills, probates, deeds, census, and other records to fill in the missing information. I've explained the source material and overall approach for the project. I did establish some principles for my research approach that I want to share here. The personal journals are a rich genealogical resource documenting the comings and goings of many people in the Union Hill neighborhood, not just the enslaved persons, but including the neighbors, overseers, and laborers. The current data contains only those directly interacting with the enslaved persons. I recognized this genealogy work was not about my family and tried to extract everything that might be relevant to others in their family history journal. And I was sensitive to not incorporating oral history or family linkages not available in the documents that I was reviewing. I recognize there are gaps and likely some errors that can be filled in by others. My goal was to release a quality data set and to make the data file usable and findable by others. I identified the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation and the repository of enslaved.org as a target audience for this work. I found a clear ontology at enslaved.org that helped guide me in building a quality data set from the start. At this point, I want to recognize the work of Derek Nicholas. Over 20 years ago, Derek Nicholas, who was descended from the enslaved persons under Nicholas Cabell at Liberty Hall, first began identifying, reconstructing, and publishing the histories of many of the Cabell enslaved persons using the Cabell family papers. At that time, the Cabell Family Society did not have an interest or perhaps felt indifferent to pursuing or even supporting his research. It took time and perhaps a generational change in our society leadership to embrace and support this research. So when I retired 3 years ago, I committed to finding the names of the persons buried at the Union Hill Slave Cemetery. I was able to leverage advances in technology and the emergence of the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation to identify a path forward to a clear and publishable ending. Though the project expanded slightly beyond just the names of those buried at Union Hill, I believe the data set is more comprehensive with additional data. This slide shows the process that I used from beginning to end. I visited the repositories and photographed the journal pages at their respective repository. I then transcribed them at my computer into one large Microsoft Word document. I would then go through the Word document and pull out a reference to an enslaved person and assemble these as events in a spreadsheet, again using the ontology provided from enslaved.org to do this. I then used the desktop genealogy software RootsMagic to put the data into a genealogy file. I chose RootsMagic because they have a rich data management tools, allowing me to update people as more information was found and to easily adjust the birth year as new facts came along. RootsMagic also had features for adding associations and allowing me to extract the data into a large Excel file. You can't get your data into a spreadsheet from Ancestry, but you can do that using RootsMagic. Once I had the data out of RootsMagic, I did do some data manipulation, cleanup, quality control, and descriptive analytics of this data set using the Python programming language in Jupyter Notebooks. I'm not going to be going over that in my presentation today, but I did publish how to do this in the notebook itself on GitHub. I also use the tool RootsMagic because of its ability to sync with Ancestry.com. Here is a summary of my observations of the journal transcriptions. Over 600 names were collected from the journal transcriptions in the court documents. Only first names were found until about 1850, and then surnames started to appear after 1850. The journals of the male Cabells spanning these 4 generations were consistent in their tone and focused on farming operations and financial and property transactions, including the purchase and sale of land and enslaved persons. Names were recorded by free white men, sometimes using adjectives in front of them that were not necessarily used when they were addressed by family, such as Tie River Will, Stoop Will, and Yellow Will. The number of free and enslaved people ages 16 to 60 in a household were counted each year as tithables for tax purposes. Sometimes they were listed by names, most frequently not. This also means that persons under the age of 16 or over the age of 60 may be underrepresented in the data set. Name spellings were clearly defined by the enslaver and sometimes varied over time and enslaver by spelling. For example, Clarissa, Clarice, Burrell, Burrill, and Burwell. I had to make a judgment call whether or not this was the same person. Events for each person were identified and classified according to the enslaved ontology and added into a large Excel spreadsheet. This bottom list here shows the different types of events that are in the data set that I have pulled together. I did add new types of events to the ontology, including altercation, which was when I found a documented fight between two enslaved persons. Punishment was when I found a documented punishment of an enslaved person by an enslaver. And also overseer agreement, which was the descriptions of the specifications of the overseer agreements in the journals. As the number of persons in the Roots Magic dataset grew, I found it necessary to start estimating birth year for everybody, so I did not duplicate them or have unrealistic lifespans for individuals. When the birth year was not explicitly provided in the journals or court documents, the following assumptions were used to estimate a birth year. I assumed women were between the ages of 14 and 42 at the birth of a child. They were at least 10 years old to be documented as receiving a necessity, and a child was established as less than 10 years old. Persons were at least 13 years old to run away, travel, or be assigned to an overseer. And persons were at least 15 years old to be assigned to an indentured craft. Frequently, I would find a list of enslaved persons with a monetary value next to their name, and I selected the person with the highest monetary value by sex to be 25 years old. Someone who was less than half the monetary value of the highest person in the list and was not listed as a child was assumed to be over 45 years old, and the term old was extrapolated to be over 60 years. Sex was determined by the references provided by the enslaver, and if that was not available, I designated the sex consistent with the biblical name reference or consistent with the English name reference. There were only about 18 people out of the 600 some that I could not establish a sex for. So the final data set includes 820 people mentioned between 1769 and 1865. This includes 663 enslaved persons, 110 enslavers, and 47 overseers. I captured 596 unique events in the documents. On the right, I have listed the surnames I identified of the enslaved persons and also the surnames identified of the overseers. I wanted to document the names of the 47 overseers, and sometimes I also found the names of their wives. The overseers had a more direct role with the enslaved persons, especially in the early years of journal writings. It was rare for the early Cabal enslavers to mention anything about an enslaved person except as a tithable. However, the later Cabal enslavers did not always use overseers and seemed to write more details about the personal and family connections of their enslaved persons. The overseer agreements were documented, and one from 1773 by William Cabell says, "Agreed with Theoderic Scruggs to be an overseer at my 2 upper plantations, over 18 or 20 hands, and I am to give him 2 shares of corn and tobacco, he doing the duty of an overseer, and is not to correct my slaves immoderately, nor to work them at unreasonable times, such as in the night or in the rains, snows, and is to allow 20 shares of corn for 4 workhorses and to pay for making the crop convenient." In 1780, William Cabell writes about the release of an overseer. He said, "Ordered William Key to come no more on my plantation for his many neglects of his duty as overseer, which young Landrum and Miss Putney are witnesses to in some instance." Lastly, the data breadth and depth across the data set varies. Some people have extensive biographies of their comings and goings, with 10% of the over 600 people having 10 or more events. However, most of them, over 60%, have only 1 event listed. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there was a gap between 1820 and 1855 that is sparsely populated. As I showed earlier, there was a lot of intra-family transfer of property and enslaved persons among the families. I had to stop several times and map out the Cabell relations to keep track of all this. On the right is a diagram of this complex map of transfers between enslavers and plantations and family. The blocks, you can see here that Colonel William Cabell gave enslaved persons to his children that are represented by the number in parentheses. William Cabell Jr., his son, received 67 enslaved persons from his father. At the same time, he married Anne Carrington, and her father, Colonel Paul Carrington from Charlotte County, gave them 12 enslaved persons when they got married. So those persons then moved to Union Hill. This tool was very helpful as I was going through documents of deeds and wills and trying to figure out where the enslaved persons went after the death of an enslaver. The boxes in blue represent plantations that I did not pursue as part of this project. This includes the Oak Ridge Plantation, which was owned by Robert Reeves, who would become one of the largest plantations of enslavers in Nelson County. As I mentioned, there were 663 enslaved persons found. I found 374 events of people getting transferred to another family plantation. I found 121 people that were sold outside of the plantation family, and 29 recorded deaths and 9 emancipations. All of the emancipations were from Daniel Higginbotham of Soldier's Joy, where he married his enslaved partner, and upon his death and his will, he declared that they would be free and paid for them to be relocated to the state of Pennsylvania, which was done. As far as movement in the plantations, I only found 51 documents of a person being purchased from outside the family. There were 420 transfers into a plantation from someone else in the family, and 65 recorded birth events. So where does the project stand now? As of now, the data set is complete and includes the names of the 820 people. The manuscript has been submitted and accepted for publication. It is in editorial processing right now and is expected to be published in the final issue this year of the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. This article covers some of the methodology and approach that I've mentioned here. I also have methodology details in a PowerPoint on GitHub. All of this is available through links on the cabell.com website. As far as the data repository, again, enslaved.org provides the services for this data repository and links the spreadsheet that I will be providing with their existing data set. So you can download the data set from the enslaved.org or the journal website once it's published, and it'll also be mirrored on ancestry.com. For genealogy resources, again, you can look at the repositories above. I've also started to compile biographies of individuals and families, and these are available on the cabell.com website under the Enslaved Persons tab. I did want to talk about using the data through Ancestry and give a little bit of warning. The data file is not in one large tree, but realize it's 800 people, some of which are in families, most of which of these, 404, are in trees of one person or less, which I'm showing here. The largest family is 122 people, which is the Cabell family enslavers. So if you're looking for someone, you can use the find feature in Ancestry to search for a specific name. It might be that you come up with a tree of one person that I've shown here, and then when you look at the person view, you can see that when it's synced with Roots Magic, it is bringing over some of the events, all of the events that are in Roots Magic, but it is not fully described, and there's some truncation of the words and the wording here due to word limitation in Ancestry. So the truest data set will be in the spreadsheet and in the database on enslaved.org. If you're having trouble doing any of this, you can also reach out to me with specific questions. So I want to go over now specific use cases where I worked with inquiries that came through the Cabell family website looking for an ancestor. The first is Henry. I met the requester, who's Tyleek Chambers, and got to know him and his story of tracking down his enslaved ancestor from the Cabell plantations. He told me that when he was a student at UVA, he had a class in Cabell Hall and asked his mother why the name sounded familiar. She told him one of their ancestors was Lou Cabell and descended from Henry Cabell, who was enslaved at, quote, that Indian place. As he continued to research the family, he discovered that that Indian place was Montezuma, known as an Indian place for being built on an Indian burial ground. Digging into Montezuma, he came across the Cabell family website and reached out to me, thinking it was a shot in the dark if I had anything about a Henry at Montezuma, born around 1810. I was able to find 2 Henrys that were enslaved at Montezuma and provided him with data sheets of each. Montezuma was owned by Hector Cabell, one of the sons of William Cabell, and then his brother Landon, and then his sister Margaret Cabell, through her husband Thomas Stanhope McClellan. Though none of these people kept journals, I was able to track some information through court records. There was no Henry named until 1835 at the death of Thomas Stanhope McClellan, and then there were 2. Both were about the same age, though one was referred to as a boy and one a man. The man Henry was listed adjacent to the name Patrick twice. The boy Henry was sold in 1835 to Seth Woodruff, a known slave trader from Lynchburg, Virginia. The other Henry remained at Montezuma until the death of Margaret Cabell, at which time he was sold to her son Thomas Stanhope McClellan Jr. in Buckingham. I provided this information to Tyleek Chambers, and he was able to identify that Henry 649, the one who went to Lynchburg, was his family that he was looking for. He was able to confirm with his family that their relative Henry did go to Lynchburg after being at Montezuma and prior to coming back to Buckingham. Another request I received through the Cabell website was information on Stephen Turner and Eliza Jane Hill. The requester, who was Jill Van Buren, said they were married at Union Hill. She provided a lot of information, some of it shown here, that showed references to the life of Stephen Turner. He was a renowned citizen of Portage, Wisconsin, and when he died in 1907, the article on the very left was published, and at which point it said he was married at Union Hill, Nelson County, Virginia, in 1849. He was also said to be one of the first black men to vote in 1860. There was an article in the newspaper again in 1907 showing that he was one of the first Negro to vote after the rebellion, and he voted in the November 1860 election in Portage, Wisconsin. Also in the newspaper articles, it mentioned his 3 children, Bluford, Elizabeth, Stephen, and Samuel. So with this information, I looked at my documents and I was able to identify Stephen Turner and Jane. So these are all the events in detailed description that I was able to find. The first event was in 1853. I did not find an event in 1849 of their marriage, but as I mentioned early, Mayo's records were not thorough until really starting 1853, 1855 time. So in 1853, Mayo records giving his son-in-law, Robert Brown, who's married to his daughter, 7 slaves, including Jane and her 2 children, Bluford and Stephen. Bluford, it was a unique name. There was only one Bluford in the entire data set, so this was really a key to finding the right Bluford and Jane. In 1855, his son, William Daniel Cabell, says that he bought eggs and butter from Stephen Turner. Also in 1855, Mayo Cabell refers to Stephen Turner as a colored man. These transactions continue with Stephen Turner buying poultry and eggs and butter from him as he comes down from the mountains. And then in 1857, November, Robert Brown, who now is the enslaver of Jane and her children, is in financial trouble and puts his property under trust to his cousin, Joseph Carrington Cabell, where the property is listed, including Jane and now her 3 children, Bluford, Stephen, and Lizzie. At that point, from November until the sale of the property in October, you can see that Joseph Carrington Cabell Jr., who is now the owner of this deeded property, is visited by Stephen Turner, and Stephen Turner brings him a barrel of apples. And Joseph Carrington Cabell records, he has a wife and 3 children at Sisters who are to be sold on the 8th of February. He seems much distressed and begs me to buy them. I never saw a Negro show such feeling. So in 1858, the sale is executed and is recorded in a deed book that Dr. Frederick Peters bought 4 slaves, Jane and 3 children, for $2,795. 9 days later, Mayo Cabell records the amount of Robert Brown in notes collections that he made, and he received $2,880.25 paid by Stephen Turner. I am making the assumption here that perhaps Frederick G. Peters bought Stevens Turner wife and 3 children for him. Frederick G. Peters' mother also had the last name Turner. I don't know if there was any relationship between her and the family of Stephen Turner. From August 1858 through February 1859, there are records of Stephen Turner liquidating his property. So I can conclude that Stephen Turner and Eliza Jane Hill were in the Union Hill neighborhood between 1853 and 1859, and it's consistent with them appearing in Portage, Wisconsin, and voting in the 1860 election in Portage, Wisconsin. So in addition to responding to specific inquiries on genealogy and helping someone find someone or anyone else using this data set for this purpose, I have wanted to pull together some biographies of some of the specific families. These biographies document families, the births and events and names of the enslaved persons in a family, and I've also included the major life events of the enslavers that would have impacted the enslaved person's biographical events. I've also included the names of the overseers and their agreements when it fell within the time range. So I'm starting with 16 families that had 3 generations or more identified, and I'm assembling these collected events and facts into a separate spreadsheet that's in the biography, and I'm putting them again on the cabell.com website. This is different than what is on enslaved.org, which is a database connecting all the people that you can search as a regular database. But these biographies are incorporating other events, as I mentioned earlier, from the enslavers that provide more insight into some of the specific goings and comings. I was interested in the biography of Harry because he had close to 20 travel events that I recorded between 1778 and 1798. I believe he was a personal servant to William Cabell Sr. He accompanied William Cabell Sr. to Williamsburg several times when William Cabell served as a delegate. He also carried items to William Cabell's sons in college at William and Mary, including cash and a sword. I had a hard time at first deciding if he was actually an enslaved person, but there was never a reference to him with a surname, and William Cabell referred to him as, quote, my man Harry. After William Cabell's death in 1798, they were transferred to his son, that is Harry and his wife Fanny, were transferred to his son Samuel Jordan Cabell of Soldier's Joy, and the last record of them was in 1823 at Soldier's Joy. They would have been close to 70 years old at that time. Huldy Hatcher was the cook at Union Hill. I was able to piece together 15 people in her family with surnames of Hatcher, Banks, and Rose, and her sons identified included John, Sam, Gustavus, and Mayo. Mayo Cabell, the enslaver, recorded her death, stating, Old Huldy Hatcher, the mother of 16 children, departed this life the 1st day of April 1854 of pneumonia, age supposed to be between 67 and 70 years of age. Though she was referred to as having 16 children, I was only able to identify 5 children. I'm going to go into some more detail on Venus and Poppy and Archer Bowling and his family. So this is an excerpt of the biography of Venus and Pompey constructed from data points in the journals and other documents. You can see here there are different types of events shown, including the earliest documented event in 1770 of receiving necessities. Pompey receives a hat on this date, and on January 22nd, 1775, William Cabell Sr. documents his barter agreement with his enslaved persons and their children to receive new hats. This was really only the only time that I saw such an agreement where he barters for them to pick cotton in receipt for a hat. So reading this, you can see that little George have a hat and he is to pay 2 pounds of cotton and Pompey security. And then later it says, let Joshua have a hat and he is to pay 4 pounds of cotton and Pompey is security. So this helped me hypothesize and establish that Joshua and George are probably children of Pompey. Venus was unique in that she was a midwife, and I found 11 entries between 1780 and 1795 where she was performing in the role of midwife. Lastly, on 30 September 1795, the death of Pompey was recorded. Negro Pompey, nearly 90 years of age, departed this life. He was an honest and faithful slave. After the death of William Cabell Sr. in 1798, you can see George and his wife Hannah, the son of Pompey and Venus, George is the son, move on to Hector Cabell and go to live at Montezuma. So at this point, they're enslaved by Hector Cabell, and in May 1805, his property, he gets into financial trouble, and his property is put into trust with his brother Landon, and the names of the enslaved persons are documented in the court documents, and George and Hannah are listed with 2 children, Nancy and Guy. Hector Cabell dies in 1807 without a will and without heirs. His estate is appraised, and we find now that there's a little Hannah associated with George and Hannah, indicating that she was probably born after 1805 and before February 1807. The last event is for an auction of the property being held by Robert Reeves. There is no documentation of what happened to these persons after the auction in December 1807. I do know that Landon Cabell moved to Montezuma, but these people were not found in his records. It could be that Robert Reeves bought them, as I do know that he established one of the largest plantations slightly west of here in Oak Ridge of Nelson County, Virginia. And I've not looked into the documentation under Robert Reeves to see if George, Hannah, Guy, Nancy, and little Hannah can be found at Oak Ridge. The biography for Archer Bowling and his family and his wife Sucky contains 66 events across 3 to 4 different plantations of Norwood, Union Hill, Colleton, and Soldier's Joy. I have taken an excerpt of about 20 of these to show you, and this is the family tree that I was able to construct using the information only in the journals. I did incorporate the death of Henry Bowling of 1886 from the information in the Union Hill enslaved persons graveyard. So events from 1810 to 1850 to 1900 have been collected, and these shows the first ones from 1810 to 1853. The first documentation of Sucky is in 1810, where William Cabell Jr. documents his enslaved persons by name and age range. This is marked with the red number 1. Sucky is listed as above 12 years old, but she would be under 16, and she's also already listed as having 1 child. So this provides the first estimate of Sucky's birth year as 1796. In 1834, I found the first reference to Archer, marked with a red 2. This was in the business journals of Soldier's Joy, where the enslavers Daniel Higginbotham pays Archer $1 for duties as a dentist to extract teeth from some of his enslaved persons. Daniel Higginbotham documented paying enslaved persons directly for their work and would emancipate his female partner and their children upon his death, as I mentioned earlier. Red number 3 shows a documentation of a birth event. I found this in Mayo's journal, where he listed the birth dates and parents of 6 of his enslaved persons that were born between 1839 and 1845. However, this entry in his journal was found on a page dated July 1851, also indicating that he was recording this after the time and perhaps did not have any journals, again, in the range of 1830s and 1840s. The red number 4 represents 3 events where Mayo Cabell distributed necessities of shoes to his enslaved persons. This is where Mayo would frequently list the people in similar groups each time that probably represented family groups in his head, but it was never documented sometimes where the family began and where the next one started. Additional events between 1857 and 1900 are shown here. This list of events shows some of the transfers between the enslavers that impacted the work and living locations of the enslaved persons. They moved between Colleton, Union Hill, and Norwood, which were neighboring plantations. The red number 1 documents the marriage of Catherine Bowling to Tarleton Fleming. The event marked with the red number 2 describes an illness event at Norwood Plantation under William Daniel Cabell, where William Daniel Cabell wrote extensively in journals, essentially from the time he graduated from college in 1854 until the time he died in 1904. Here he describes how Amy got badly burned and how they're treating her sores with Castile soap, and he has directed Hannah to take good care of her and to see her to her wants. Beverly, Louisa's husband, kept old Amy from being burnt to death. Old Henry is sick and little Harriet is sick, each complaining of pain in their limbs. have a good load of oak wood carried to Amy's house. And event number 4 was found in the personal diary of Sarah Randolph Cabell, one of Mayo's last daughters who was living in Union Hill. She records engaging with Catherine Fleming to sell some eggs and references her as, quote, one of the few old servants still remaining around the area. And this was in September 1900. I want to go back to the Union Hill Slave Cemetery that I mentioned earlier. Once I had the complete data set, I could filter on who was at Union Hill or Colleton and potentially died there and buried at the slave cemetery. Since I don't know when the graveyard was first or last used, I made the assumptions that people born before 1825 or died before 1886 could be buried there. 1886 was chosen as it was the date of the death of Henry Bowling, the one marker that we could read from the slave cemetery. This gave me a list of 277 names, and 221 of these were actually born before 1800, so it's probably a realistic list. It's a little higher than the estimate of about 150 people buried there, but probably the best we can do for now. And this list of names is also posted on cabell.com. In the session handout provided, I have written the links of where you can access this data. As I mentioned earlier, the truest data will be found in the Excel file on enslaved.org when published later this year. You can perhaps find a less usable version of this data on Ancestry, as I mentioned earlier. And the data and biographies are being compiled on the cabell.com website. If you want to contribute a biography of one of the enslaved persons in this file or at a Cabell family plantation, please reach out to me at my email below or contacting me through the Cabell website. While the breadth and depth of this project was greatly facilitated by finding the personal journals of the enslavers from the Union Hill neighborhood of plantations, I think that this methodology could also be used using available court records such as wills, deeds, marriages, births, and chancery records. I've done a cursory look at this starting with the earliest deed and will books from Amherst County and was surprised by the level of documentation in those books. Amherst and Nelson County have well-preserved records that supports this kind of work, and I recognize other counties such as Buckingham do not have these records preserved. One of the critical tools that helped me in the study was understanding the enslaver family tree. So building a community family tree in Amherst and Nelson County, where many of the enslaver families intermarried, really helps understand the linkages that would be found in the deed or will books. Thank you for the opportunity to share this work. We will now open it up for live questions.